up, everyone? Welcome back to Debating Metal. I'm your host, Kenneth Dean, the Dean of Metal, along with my co-host, Kaye. Today, we're doing something completely different than normal. Today, we're going to dive into what we think are career-defining albums by our favorite metal artists.
We're talking about albums that allowed for artists to headline arenas instead of clubs. Albums that started new genres and earned these bands their biggest accolades. Grammys, platinum albums, sex, money, and drugs. Today we're picking 6 albums each that defined the careers of some of our favorite bands.
And when we're done, Chris and I are going to give you our big 4 life-changing metal albums. So sit back, relax, turn it up to 11, and let the debate begin. Chris, these albums that we're going to talk about, career-defining albums, there's probably going to be a lot of debate on this, not necessarily between you and I, but like whoever's listening. And I'm hoping this stirs up a shit ton of commentary because, you know, there may be an album here that we picked that someone will sit to say, no, it was this album before that, or no, it was the album that came after. And that's fine. You know what? Leave the comments, you know, start the debate online, you know, and let us know. And I'll write you back in a heartbeat, you know. But it's so funny because this is one of those subjects where it's definitely one of those things where you can get into a serious, heavy duty conversation with someone else and have completely differing opinions. And that might happen to you and I, because we haven't really talked much about these albums.
Yeah, I mean, we picked our choices, and you know, some of them I already kind of questioned one we talked about a little bit, but I think that's part of what the debate is. So, I don't know. Who do you want to start today?
You made me start last week, so I guess you'll start this week.
All right, so I guess let's just get going. My first choice for today was Pantera with Vulgar Display of Power. The reason I picked it instead of, say, Cowboys from Hell, well, Cowboys from Hell kind of like set up where the direction they were going, and it was their first really well-known album. This was, you know, their 6th album, 1992. This was the album that really like defined what groove metal would be. I would say it's like the groove metal blueprint, even though they would get heavier with the next, you know, succeeding albums. I think this was the one that really established, you know, this is what Pantera is. This is what their sound is. They've become this band, and so many bands would emulate the things that they would do. You know, older bands that existed prior started kind of evolving into groove. You know, we talked about Overkill at one point, talking about how they kind of adapted the groove sound. Other bands did the same to survive that were more traditional heavy metal bands before that. And this album just really took them to the next level. Cowboys from Hell started it. This took it just that many steps further. Just what do you think?
Well, it's funny because, you know, when you first started talking about Vulgar, he's like, oh, this is their 6th album. And yes, it is their 6th album.
It's their second well-known album, but
right.
They had been a band essentially for 6 albums at this point.
They've been a band since 1983, you know, just as long as a lot of bands that we know from the classic thrash era, if you want to look at it, that even though they weren't thrash. But it's so funny because essentially they become, you know, from their 4th album, Power Metal to Cowboys, they become a completely different band. And, you know, they get signed to a major label. So things, I mean, it's like literally like they closed one door, opened up another door, and everything changed. And that's
absolutely
fine.
Yeah.
You know, so, and Vulgar, I agree with you. Vulgar gave them more opportunities. They really set the tone at this point. Cowboys from Hell, if you listen carefully, there's still some little fringe melodies that came from their glam days, if you want to put it that way.
Well, I mean, even Cemetery Gates is
Right.
the last kind of instance of the ballad for them. You know, the high pitched screams. There's even Cowboys from Hell. The song still has those screams that kind of came before, whereas Phil's vocals really took a shift with this album.
Right.
And if you listen from power metal to Cowboys from Hell to Vulgar Display of Power, you definitely see an evolution. Like there is an arc there where it's not just like a shift. Like all of a sudden they went from, if you took it power metal to Vulgar Display of Power, you'd be like, what the hell? You know? But having Cowboys in between, you see that like where that evolution came from.
Right. So, we're talking about Vulgar, and Vulgar, I mean, man, uh, when I remember hearing Walk, and I didn't know anything about Pantera, but I remember hearing Walk, and I was like, oh, I've heard this song before, somewhere, somehow. And I was like, this is a really cool song, And so, my best friend at the time when I was living in Miami was Matt, and he was like, no, all he was about was Pantera. I mean, he talked Pantera all the time, and I was just like, man, well, who is this band? And then of course, for me, I was still one of these people that were, uh, I can't call myself straight edge at that point because I did have the occasional beer, I did have the occasional alcoholic drink, but I never took drugs. So I wasn't as straight edge as people who live the straight edge lifestyle.
He's not
But
as straight edge as CM Punk.
no, or Darby Allin or whatever. But the issue is, um, when Daryl went from being Diamond Daryl to Dimebag, it was kind of almost like a disappointment to me. I think I mentioned this in a previous episode, but I've let all those things go. I don't care anymore about all that shit. So, but at the time I did, and I was kind of like, I don't know if I want to get into this band because all they do is promote drugs, and I was just stupid about it. I was fucking, you know, what 21 years old at the time, so I was an idiot. But anyhow, I eventually got the album, and this album is amazing, and I can see why going from Cowboys, it was a big step. Um, it was definitely more groove. Some songs were even faster, but it's still grooved. Walk is just literally you can walk and all you're doing is bopping your head the whole fucking time.
Yeah, it's what a killer song.
Oh yeah,
I remember the first time I heard it, and I was so blown away. It was it took me like a little bit to absorb it because it was one of those things that I'm just listening to, and what is this?
exactly. I mean, the album itself, Vulgar, released 4 singles, and Walk happened to be the last single, which was almost a year after the album came out. Because the album came out in February of '92.
Yeah.
Walk wasn't released as a single to the general public until 1993. But that doesn't mean that within that year no one knew about it, because obviously it was selling well, and it did sell well. But I think that's the one song, even after a year, that finally kind of, it had legs, but it finally gave it, it started running as opposed to just building. It's a double platinum album. It's Pantera's biggest selling album, and there's a reason why.
For sure.
To me, that's the album to me that is definitely that has defined their career.
All right. So, what do you got for your first choice today?
My first choice is going to be Motley Crue, and it's going to be Motley Crue's "Shout at the Devil." Now, I don't know how people are going to feel about that, because a lot of people, sit there and say, well, Too Fast for Love is their best album. We ourselves did a head-to-head between this album, Shout at the Devil, and Dr. Feelgood, and I believe both of us went with Shout at the Devil as being the better album, but we also did a worst to first. So if I'm not mistaken, when we did this episode, you and I both had Shout at the Devil as the number 1 album, but we had number 2 as Too Fast for Love. So the reason being is, yes, Too Fast for Love set the tone, if you want to put it that way, for what Motley Crue would eventually, and I wouldn't say would become, because they change with every album, but it set the tone for them getting, in the door, through the door, bigger clubs, not arenas just yet, but Shout at the Devil blew the doors open for them, and the opportunities were great. I mean, in between Too Fast for Love and Shout Out the Devil, they opened up for Kiss for a week, I think it was, before Kiss threw them off the tour for what Gene Simmons labeled as bad behavior. And and then they make Shout Out the Devil, they go on tour with Ozzy, and besides All Hell Breaking Loose, their career just took off. And
Bad behavior.
I was trying to do my Gene Simmons impression. Bad behavior.
It's not bad. It's not bad.
Anyhow, so what do you obviously I know what you think about the album, but what do you think about this album?
I mean, to me, what they did with Too Fast for Love started things off, but they refined it for Shout at the Devil. They really took it to the next level. The album's more cohesive. There's a lot of like raw, awesome stuff on the first album, but it was just, a lot of times a band, there obviously is the sophomore slump. Some bands will hit and then they really take off with the third album, etc. But they really didn't have a sophomore slump. They went right into the next album, and after that, yeah, they have a couple that aren't quite as good, but they still continued with the hits. It wasn't like they ever just dropped off until after Dr. Feelgood, really. So, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, what's funny about that when you say that, like, you think about Theater Pain, and even they don't like the album themselves, but it had the strength of two really big songs. The cover, Smoking in the Boys' Room, and then Home Sweet Home. Then you go to Girls, 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 and they have the title track, as well as Wild Side. So each of the albums, and then Feel Good obviously had Feel Good, it had Kickstart My Heart, it had Without You. So it had some big singles. So they were able to transcend what would be relatively albums, with the rest of the album, the rest of the songs, and the singles were so strong that it transcended that. I mean, it made them a platinum artist, but the albums weren't necessarily that great as a whole. The singles were awesome.
Yes, and sometimes an album can succeed quite well, just based on the singles. So.
Exactly. And so they made a career out of that, and that's great. I mean, this album had great tracks. I mean, it had Looks to Kill, big single, the first single on the album. Helter Skelter was the second single, and it didn't really do anything. It didn't really move the needle for them, but they were able to release a picture disc, and they had a poster, and it was the famous what they called the blood photo sessions, and it continued to establish their persona. And then they came out with Too Young to Fall in Love, and that's when the doors just blew wide open. MTV was playing the crap out of that song, and while it only went to to number 90 on the singles charts, on MTV it was number one every day for months. And that's a testament, that maybe I would say that the people who watched MTV were more rockers than they were radio people for the most part, and they just fell in love with Motley Crue at that time. So it was a big album.
Yeah, and MTV obviously had such a huge impact on whether an album could succeed or fail back then.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And just giving it that airplay pretty much made it a guaranteed success.
I mean, while they weren't in reality, the look that they had wasn't necessarily glam.
Mm-hmm.
They had that makeup look to them anyway. They put on like the football, sports, athletic looking makeup, but they still, they did tease the hair, but they were very rough looking. It wasn't until theater that they really went glam, but they just fit that MTV style. They primmed and prompted themselves up. I don't know if that was the right term, but they teased
not, but yeah, I get what you're saying.
They got themselves, all gussied up, and they became MTV darlings. All right, well, let's move on to the next album. So, what's your next choice?
So I'm gonna go with one that you are probably not super familiar with, but it's an important one in the Scandinavian world. At the Gates, Slaughter of the Soul. So at the Gates, I had been familiar with pretty much after their career. I know they've come back since, but in 1996 they called it quits. Basically, they started in the early 90s. I want to say 1990, and went through 1996. They really kind of cultivated what was known as the Gothenburg sound. We've talked about that a couple times with bands like In Flames, Dark Tranquillity. These guys all really knew each other, crossed over bands, and in that Gothenburg area of Sweden, they kind of created this new sound. And At the Gates, Slaughter of the Soul, being their last album, really was their most successful up until that point. It was one of those albums that it really got universal acclaim when it came out. It helped define what that Gothenburg sound would be. And even though they split up afterward, there was just this uh, presence of this album. People in the scene, people in the area. It started expanding. A lot of times, like we talk about, like in the early '80s, there was all the tape trading, etc. Well, this was another kind of explosion of that again. And the other bands would really pick up on that the established sound of what they had created and take it to the next level. Um, so I ended up kind of starting from the end of their career and going back because, back then it was you're having to find CDs, and especially stuff that's from overseas, it was kind of hard to find. So, this was my entry point to the band. Really cool sound, really good album from beginning to end. I think it's one that, 1995, that's almost 30 years ago at this point. I hate to say that, but it it's one that I feel like maybe gets overlooked in this generation, but at least the band has come back since. And I guess it was a few years back. Anders, one of the Bjarler brothers, that was the guitarist for the band, left the band, but now he's come back. So I want to say it was last year he actually rejoined the band. So that's kind of exciting. So it's really pretty much the classic lineup. It's this particular lineup that's back, and at least they're still kind of touring, really playing the same kind of music. They left, they came back in, or they broke up, they came back in I want to say it was like 2010, 2011, and then they released their first album since in 2014, and it was like kind of almost like they never dropped off. They kind of went back and just did the same thing again. So it's nice to every once in a while you still get bands that still pay tribute and still do the same kind of things they did before, and you're not listening to some a band that's calling themselves the same thing, and there's no evolution, right? Like, it's different when a band's still around and they play, you know 15 different albums, and they you see that evolution. But it's nice to, like, if they've had a long break, that they don't come back and they're just a completely different band.
No, I totally understand that. And it's funny because it's not a lot of times will a band take such a long break and come back with the same classic lineup that they had when they broke up.
Yeah.
And then to still go through essentially one lineup change when Anders left and now he's back. So they're literally back to the classic lineup that recorded Slaughter to the Soul. So it's I mean that's a testament to the band themselves and to the fact that they enjoy making this music and enjoy being together, because could have easily just said, you know what, I'm either the singer or the guitarist, the two brothers could have just said, yeah, we're gonna just do this and screw the rest of the guys.
Yeah, I mean, that's originally what happened. Was the two brothers left, and they formed the Haunted, and then we've talked about them before.
Mhm.
So they formed the Haunted, and the other two guys were like, we can't continue without them. Or other, yeah, three guys. Yeah.
Right.
So it's because they're such an integral part of the sound. They were the primary songwriters in a lot of cases. So if you continue without that, like we've seen tons of bands over the years, like when you don't have that influence, it, it's not the same band.
No, exactly.
So
We
I love that integrity in them too. Is like if we're not going to be the same guys, we're not going to continue.
No, that's a testament to the band themselves. I mean, I listened to Slaughter of the Soul on the way home um, today. I've listened to pretty much most of it, and I mean, it's well produced, especially. And it's funny to say it because there's certain things that came out in the '90s out in Scandinavia that sound like shit, and I'm not talking about black metal. It's just they just
I mean, that's intentional. So.
Right, exactly. That's intentional. But some of the stuff that came out, in that part of the world, low budget, didn't sound that great. But this actually sounds pretty good. I listened to it. I mean, it is definitely the blueprint of what is melodic death metal. It's amazing that at the time that this came out, or even at the gates when they established their career, that you go from a world that is coming to the end of the grunge era at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously grunge is an American thing, and it had a small effect out in Europe, not as much of a major effect in Europe as it did here, but this was like almost like an answer, like, fuck you and your grunge, we're gonna do this. And this was so far off on the one side. It's amazing, and the scene took off,
It
obviously.
is always kind of a case where certain genres of music spawn out of almost an answer to what came before. I mean, we talked about grunge being an answer to the hair metal, the glam metal being, we're not going to put all this effort in, and we've got real attitude, and then you have the like the old heavy metal, like Judas Priest, kind of coming out of that mentality of, we can't get jobs, we're young men that are being held back, and songs like Breaking the Law come out of it. So I always feel like every genre is kind of coming out of an answer to a previous generation saying, we don't have the same values as you.
Right. Totally understand that. I thought the album was pretty impressive, especially for being 1995, and that scene not being huge worldwide.
Yeah, I mean, it opened up a lot of doors for other bands that would take advantage of that too. Dark Tranquility's since become a lot bigger in the U.S. In Flames as well. I mean, and those took time to happen, but I mean, some of the other bands that I'm going to mention in just a bit, it's the same kind of story. Without these kind of landmark albums, even though they're not like multi-platinum giant albums, but they still really opened up the scene for not just themselves, but for other bands too.
Right, exactly. So, it's a shame that they ended up, breaking up so that the brothers could do the Haunted. But at the same time, who knows what would have happened? We before we started recording, we had that similar conversation about Metallica and certain things, and it applies to every band. What would have happened if this? What would have happened if that? And no one knows. It's a great thing to debate, but the bottom line is, at the end, there is no definitive answer other than what physically and emotionally, put it that way, happened in public.
So, one last question about this album: did you notice that Andy LaRocque had a solo on the song "Cold"?
I saw that I'm reading about it, but I did not pay attention to the song specifically.
Oh, okay. It's a good solo, and so Anders has said that he still can't play the solo.
That is pretty funny.
Yeah. That's just Andy LaRocque. He's so good.
Oh, I know. He's an amazing guitar player. Does not get enough credit. All right, so that's going to bring me to my next album, and my next album is going to be Quiet Riot and Metal Health. And so this is very similar kind of deal not exactly the same, but similar into how Pantera was. They had some previous albums that really were independent, small or minor, whatever. Quiet Riot had two albums that were released in Japan that were released on Sony Music in Japan, but Sony Music in Japan is just like it's a big label in Japan, but it's not a worldwide label. It's not the same Sony Music that we know of today. So this album basically is the debut album for those four guys, Kevin Dubrow, Frankie Banali, Rudy Sarzo, or Chuck Wright, depending on which song we're talking about, and Carlos Cavasso. Randy had already passed away by the time this album came out, so Randy Rhoads was on the first two, and then Carlos Cavasso joined the band when they reunited, because it was originally Dubrow, and that's when Rudy Sarzo came into the picture, and then they just decided to do reestablish the name Quiet Riot. Just a weird history with this band. But this album, let's see, this album comes out in early 1983, and it in March of 1983, it comes out, no fanfare, no nothing. It's not something that is blowing the doors off of record companies or MTV or anything like that. And they get a gig playing the US Festival in May of 1983. And I believe they were the openers, either them or Motley Crue. I can't remember which one, but I know both of them played in the daylight early in the afternoon. And they got that. And then all of a sudden people began to take notice of Quiet Riot. Well, in August, a couple months later, they released Come On Feel the Noise as a single. And that song just exploded all over the place. I mean, it was on radio.
Come on, Phil. The noise exploded all over.
I mean, and they spell it that way. So, I mean, the song was just all over the place. It was on the radio. It was on MTV. It was everywhere. And, if it wasn't for that song, they don't have a career. It's not even this. Doesn't even say this album, because even with Metal Health being a big hit that it was, I don't think that this album is as huge and Quiet Riot is as huge as they became without Come On Feel the Noise being a giant hit. I mean, the song went all the way to number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100 charts, and then that propelled the album to go to number 1 for several weeks at the end of 1983. So it's wild how that one song literally made their career. This song and this album in general was the career defining moment for this band. What do you think about that?
I mean, for sure. Obviously there's the original Quiet Riot. I mean, it's essentially almost a different band, because they've disbanded, and then Dubrow brings it back and says, can I use the name? So it's really a different band. It's kind of the same thing as we've talked about with Judas Priest, where there was a Judas Priest before with Al Atkins, and then there's another Judas Priest after, and that's the Judas Priest we know. So, they start off with this first album. It goes crazy. It becomes one of the largest. It's almost like a major point in history for metal, right? Because without this album gaining the traction that it did, a lot of other bands don't exist, because the record companies, on the merit of the what this album did, started hiring up every band they could find. So this was a huge moment in metal history, not just for the album, but for like other bands. I mean, realistically, right?
No, I completely agree. Because
oh, go ahead.
No, what I was going to say is, that if I'm not mistaken, this was the first metal album to actually go number 1 on the Billboard charts.
It is.
So that's a huge thing.
And that's what I'm saying is, like, just based on that alone, the record companies said, we want more metal acts. Like, we see the potential in this finally. And so, I don't. They never really hit these heights again, but it did enough for metal to really cause a lot of the bands that we love to even exist.
No, absolutely. I mean, between, Van Halen made it in 1977, 78. They got signed in 77. They released Van Halen 1 in 78. But as much as Eddie was influential in that, and the album did really well, the scene didn't blow up until Motley Crue and Too Fast for Love kind of took off.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's 1981 and then 82. This album comes out in 83 and really, I mean, obviously Motley Crue was already signed. Dokken was already signed. Quiet Riot is signed and they blow up. And then all of a sudden the race was on. We need to sign every single, glam band that's in LA.
Yeah.
So 1983 was a huge year for these bands, getting signed and releasing albums. It was enormous. This album also had a re-recording of a song from the second Quiet Riot on QR2 that had Randy Rhoads on it. It had the song "Slick Black Cadillac." And one thing I kind of noticed today, I was looking at the credits and I was like, QR2 says the song was written by Kevin Dubrow and Randy Rhoads, and then on Metal Health it just says Kevin Dubrow, and I'm like curious about that. Like, how did Randy Rhoads drop off? Unless it was something that they changed the song and just kept the lyrics or something like that. I don't remember, but I'm pretty sure the song was the same, or relatively close.
Yeah.
And another thing too, this album had a song called Thunderbird, which when you look back on it, one can think that song is about Randy Rhoads and his passing. But in reality, that song was written before Randy passed away, because Kevin Dubrow was so heartbroken that Quiet Riot was breaking up and Randy was going to join the Ozzy band, that this is the song he wrote. Basically, Thunderbird fly, let your, spread your wings and fly. And because he wanted success for his really good friend Randy Rhoads. And that's a testament to Kevin Dubrow and their relationship. But it's funny, I could have swore for years that this was his tribute to Randy after Randy passed, but I came to learn that wasn't the case.
But it came out after he passed, right?
Yeah, the song came out after he passed away,
So
which is
so
odd. But
so in some capacity, maybe it is, but not originally intended to be, right?
right,
So,
exactly. All right, so what do you got?
all right. So the next band I'm going to talk about is Opeth. We haven't really talked too much about Opeth in our show, and we probably should at some point. But the album in question is going to be Blackwater Park. Blackwater Park came out in 2001. This was an album that really kind of opened the gates for a lot of bands. It wasn't a huge commercial success in the US at the time, but it really gained traction as time went on. Um, it was a stylistic change for them. I had been a fan before, and I really loved their album "My Arms Your Hearse." I was a big fan of Morning Rise. At that point, they're releasing albums that Morning Rise. Listen to the length of the tracks. We were talking about how track length will scare people off sometimes. So the first track is 13 minutes and 44 seconds. The second one is 10 minutes and 59 seconds, then 10 minutes and 9 seconds, then 20 minutes and 14 seconds. And then the final track of 5 is 10 minutes and 54 seconds. So as time went on, what they released this album, it's got 8 tracks, only 3 over 10 minutes, and the rest are around 5 to 7 minutes, somewhere right around that length. So a big change in their kind of accessibility to a lot of fans. They release a huge song called Harvest. Harvest is a clean vocal track where they had used clean vocals in the past. This was a purely clean vocal song. Had progressive metal or progressive death metal, I guess you would call the album. So it was very open to a new generation. I remember hearing people that I never would have thought talk about, Opeth in my high school. Like I remember people that were predominantly say, the Godsmack fans or Slipknot fans or Metallica fans that were more on the mainstream saying, "Have you heard Opeth?" And I remember that kind of groundswell at the time, which was crazy, because I'm the guy who listened to all these bands back then. I remember being kind of not an outcast, but just like, oh, this is the guy that listens to all the screaming stuff, right? And so this comes along. There was couple other albums that I remember the same kind of thing happening, but this one was one of the biggest ones that like people were like, "Wow, this is something different." And it was like somehow you have death metal and it's like smooth too, right? It's like soft. There's moments that are just like ambient, and it was something different that I had never heard. And this was, I think, widely regarded as kind of their magnum opus. It became the turning point for the band, and I think they've since done bigger things, but this was that moment that I think opened a lot of the world's eyes to who Opeth was.
So I'm listening to this album on the way home today because I had that amount of time. Actually, I listened to more of At the Gates on the way home, and then
Yeah.
I was listening to this one. Once I kind of sped through the last few songs of At the Gates, just because I'm like, all right, this sounds very similar to the previous one. So I got about halfway through each of those songs, and then I jumped to Opeth. So I'm listening to the Leper Affinity. So I listened for a song. Okay, so it's 10 minutes long. I listened to like all 10 minutes, and I don't think I've ever heard a song throw so much shit into one song, one track like that. I mean, it's like, hey, I need that instrument over here now. Come here, give me that one. The piano. I want the piano. And it's like, okay, some clean vocals here at the end. Yeah, yeah. Dude, it was nuts. I mean, it was a good song, but it was like, okay, what else are we going to do? Because it's like four different songs in one, or something to that effect. It's a several different songs in one, or that's what I thought or think. Whatever. I don't know if I'm exactly right or what.
Well, and that's kind of what I was saying to you when we were talking about this earlier. Was that often feel like when you listen to an Opeth song, you're listening to um, a musical piece rather
Right.
than
Exactly.
like just a song, a bop or something like that. You're listening to movements. The beginning starts like Leper Affinity starts off very soft, and then it just explodes into that one riff that it's like it's just really heavy, really like heavy in the attack, right? And then it goes into like a completely different riff with just blinding fast drums, right? And then it slows down, kind of mid-paced, jazzy stuff in the center, and then you're getting into, like you said, there's the soft vocals that are kind of like in the distance almost, and it's playing acoustic guitar, and then all of a sudden you get a revised version of the original riff, and there's just so many elements going on that you're almost it's like listening to, like, you go to a symphony and you hear like there's different movements of a song, and you're following a journey, and that's what I've always found to be really interesting about Opeth.
Well, it's extremely interesting, and I found it. So I'm listening to. I'm pretty sure it was Harvest. I don't remember. It's a softer song, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Third track on the album.
So I'm listening to this track, and I'm like, okay, so where's the death metal part of this? And then I don't know if it's a song, if it's Bleak or if it's the Drapery Falls, but it continues in that vein to some extent, right? And I'm
Drapery Falls is the one that kind of continues where
okay.
Harvest left off. It's a little heavier, but it kind of continues that.
So I'm
Yeah.
listening to this, and I'm like, okay, so this is cool, right? This is there's a bit of heaviness here, but it's not like death metal heavy by any means whatsoever, and it's not it's weird.
Except for the vocals.
Exactly, except for the
Yeah.
vocals, and even then, it's not like Amon Amarth death metal style vocals or Cannibal Corpse style death metal vocals. It's not that, it has, like the album has flashes of that all over the place, but it's so that just going from Harvest to Drapery Falls, and I'm like, this isn't that heavy per se. I
Yeah.
mean, it's a metal, but I'm like, wow, this is interesting. This is something that's a little proggy. It's a little, you know, mainstream almost to some degree, and I'm like, okay, I could dig this, but and it was like I didn't really know what to think. I'm like, this isn't that fucking heavy in that regards. And the reason I kept coming back to that line is because obviously, Metallica 72 Seasons came out and people talk about how much Metallica's changed, right? And I'm sitting there thinking, well shit, half the stuff on 72 Seasons is faster and heavier than this shit, right? It's like, well, what's going on here? There's a double standard, I think, to some extent.
But it's heavy in a different way because it's moody, right? It's
Right.
it's it's different. So, but it's funny, you cannot judge Opeth by one album, and that's the best way I can say it because
Well, and I heard, if I'm not mistaken, last week I listened to Deliverance, which is,
Deliverance is way heavier.
yes, it was a lot heavier, and I'm like, okay, so I'm this is all over the place,
So,
which is
oh,
fine.
and you're in for a treat if you ever hear Damnation because Damnation is the exact opposite of Deliverance. And
So-
they even were released back to back, and they were intentionally done like basically separating the two elements of what came in Blackwater Park, where the Blackwater Park had those soft parts and then the really heavy parts. Well, Damnation was like all the heavy parts. I mean, sorry, not Damnation. Sorry, Deliverance was all the heavy parts, and then Damnation was all the light stuff. So it was almost like two different bands. And then they do Ghost Reveries, and I want to say Watershed might have been the last one that used death metal vocals. And then after that, he's Michael Ackerfeld, the singer, has completely eschewed using death metal vocals except for when playing older songs in concert. So one to check out for sure. If you're getting into Opeth and you want to hear like what they're all about, you got to check out the live concert at the Royal Albert Hall
Mhm.
because they play like a really wide variety of what they do. Their entire career basically, and just hearing like this soft-spoken dude talk to a crowd of progressive metalheads is the best way I can say it. And then this is a song that I wrote about uh, dark feelings. It's like what? It's so funny.
I mean, I got to respect. So here's my take on a lot of this stuff, and it's really interesting that European. I'll put it that way. European tastes in metal are obviously very different. There's a different style of writing, in England. There's a different style of writing in Scandinavia, um, and it's so different from American bands. And then on top of that, the audiences are so different as well. You have American audiences which are extremely fickle. They want what they want. And if they don't get it, then they're on to the next thing. Where in European audiences, and I'm going to just use an example as a complete extreme. You'll have metal guys that may or may not be into songs or music similar to Taylor Swift, pop music, maybe even pop country, and yet they'll still go to Wacken and they're listening to death metal on that weekend. They can go to those extremes and no one says a damn thing.
True.
Okay, German. I mean, look, David Hasselhoff is fucking huge in Germany, right? And yet, Germans will like it. They like accept. They like Udo. They like all that heavy shit, and they're still gonna love their fucking David Hasselhoff. But it's the same guy. The same thing with Rammstein. It's just so cool. That is such a cool thing to be able to have that kind of uh, eclecticness and not be frowned upon by the guy next to you, because you know what? He's got the same eclecticness too. And that's really cool. I mean, that's the thing I like about that part of the world. They don't give a shit what the next guy listens to. They're going to listen to whatever the hell they want. If you don't like it, too bad. They don't give a shit. And if you do, then great. It's awesome. And that's so what's the word I'm trying to the phrase I'm trying to get. It's such a it's such a good thing to know, I guess you could say. And you get a band like Opeth who can do all this different stuff and people still dig them for one or the other.
Oh yeah, I actually recently had a friend. I'm not a fan of Creed, but a friend of mine said like he was embarrassed that he likes Creed, and I said to him like very honestly, dude, you do not have to care what other people think. If you like the band and you enjoy the music, listen to it. His life is way too short not to listen to the things you enjoy.
Absolutely.
And that's just the truth. Like if you like any kind of music, if you like a band that people make fun of, it doesn't matter. Like it really doesn't. Listen to it. If you liked Winger in the 80s and Beavis and Butthead made fun of it and you stopped listening to it, listen to them again, because it's there's no point in being worried about what other people think about the music that you love.
Hi, my name is Dean.
You're a Winger fan?
I was gonna say I'm a Nickelback fan.
That's fair too. All right, so what do you got for your next choice?
All right, so my next album is Poison. Open Up and Say Ah. There's a trend here. I don't know if everyone's noticed, but it's all fucking glam metal. And there's a reason why. I stayed away from the thrash bands. I stayed away from Metallica's and well, not Anthrax. That's coming up, but I stayed away from a lot of these real big bands because it's obvious. So we talk about them all the time. So I wanted to bring up some bands that we haven't talked about much. All right, so Poison, Open Up and Say Ah. A lot of people are going to turn around and say, oh, well, they were pretty big with their first album. Look what the Cat dragged in, that came out 2 years prior. And they had that song, Talk Dirty to Me. And I Won't Forget You. And I Want Action. Yeah, it was a pretty big album. I think it went double platinum. That opened the doors. But this album made him a household name. Okay, they let off with the single "Nothing But a Good Time," and that came out in April of '88. And then they did "Fallen Angel." So they've got these big songs on MTV. They're all over MTV. They're the poster children for MTV and the glam metal scene and all that stuff. But then all of a sudden they released a single called "Every Rose Has Its Thorn." That changed the game. That changed the game for them, and it was pretty much over at that point. I mean, they were household names. This Bret Michaels was loved by everybody. Still wasn't there on Rock of Love yet, but
well, yeah, he wasn't loved by everyone on there.
But anyhow, I mean,
I gotta tell you though, I watched the first season. I think I watched the first 2 seasons of Rock of Love, and it was really entertaining television at the time. And I hate reality TV shows, but something about that show just really amused me. I'm not embarrassed to say that I watched it. The second season sucked, but the first season was just hilarious to me because it was like Brett was just like, I really feel like we have an emotional connection, but this girl's got big tits, it was such a whack show, man.
It was. But before that show came along, this album came out in 1988, and I mean, it's a great album. I mean, if you like glam music or if you like pop metal, I that's what I used to call it back in the day, pop metal. I called it metal in general, heavy metal, because thrash had a distinctive sound to it, distinctive style that it was two different things. So this, was the mainstream, and I mean, you like in Poison, you like in Motley Crue, you like in Cinderella, you like Dokken, you like Tesla, you like all these bands at the same time. And this album, I mean, I just remember Every Rose That Has Its Thorn just being all over the radio. If I'm not mistaken, what is it here? It was it's number 34. It was named the 34 VH1's greatest songs of the 80s. On the charts it was a number one hit in the Billboard not album charts, on the singles. The Billboard Hot 100. It became a number one song. How many weeks? I don't know. It doesn't tell me. But it's crazy. This song was all over. I mean, it's a gold record in the United States, gold single. It was a silver single in the UK. It was all over the radio all the time in 1988 and 1989. And this song is what made them a household name. Love on the Rocks, great song. Nothing But a Good Time, great song. Back to the Rockin' Horse, good song. Look But You Can't Touch, good song. Fallen Angel, big hit on MTV, good song. I mean, this was a great album if you like that kind of metal. You couldn't keep away from it because it was just there everywhere. And they also changed their style just a little bit. I mean, the makeup, the whole thing about looking like girls like they did on the first album kind of went away. They were a little bit more stripped down. They still teased their hair to some degree, but like Brett was more of the kind of the look he has now. That's what he ended up establishing out of this.
So bald.
Well, he's never shown his head. We don't know if he's really bald or not, or if the bandana
allegedly,
or if the bandana has hair attached to it or not. He's got that whole Hulk Hogan thing going on.
Yeah.
But I mean, look, I like the album. I mean, it sold 5 million copies in the US. I mean, that's a pretty household album. What are your thoughts on it?
I mean, I'm not a Poison fan. I mean, we talked about this album before, right? Where we did, what was it? Did we do this against Flesh and Blood? Right?
No, was it this one against Flesh and Blood?
Or no, we did them against somebody else.
Yeah, I think it was them against Tesla.
We never did. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think if I'm gonna pick a Poison album that I would prefer, it'd probably be Flesh and Blood. I just nothing about Poison really ever appealed to me. I do like the song. What's the one from the first album that was a big hit? Talk Dirty to Me.
Talk Dirty to Me. Yeah.
I like. What's the one off of this next album this is how much I love.
This would be the next album. So this one, nothing.
No. The Flesh and Blood. I'll Ride the Wind off of Flesh and Blood.
Ride the Wind. Huh?
That's about what I like from Poison. Honestly, Every Rose Has Its Thorn. I think I've heard enough times that I never need to hear it again. There's been plenty of covers of it, and I don't know. I think its best use was on Rock of Love, where it was almost like ironically. Nothing but a good time. It's a classic. It's one of those that if it comes on, I probably won't change it. It's one of those it's systematically written to be a hit. But Poison just never did anything for me. So sorry.
No, hey, it's understandable. I mean, that was the era that I lived in. If you were into metal, it was one of those things, because I started when metal, or not. I became a fan of metal when it came out of the underground, the whole '80s metal scene that came out of out of LA.
Yeah,
but I grew up in New York, so there was glam in New York. It was different to me. It was very well. It's hard to say. Some of it was sleazy. I mean, there was Twisted Sister, and things like that. And but obviously we just mentioned them. Doc and Motley Crue, Wasp was big.
Yeah.
Armored Saint, Striper. All these bands were just all flooding the airwaves, flooding MTV, and Poison was one of them. Cinderella, Tesla in '86. All these bands were just coming out of the woodworks, and there's a bajillion more I haven't even mentioned. And and then stuff is coming out of New York and all that shit, and then of course at the same time this thrashing out of San Francisco, and you got Metallica, you got Megadeth, you have Anthrax that started up in New York. Megadeth decides they want to blow up the world and go do everything they can to punish Metallica. Slayer, Testament, the whole second wave, Exodus, and all that stuff. I mean, it was all at the same time. Think about that. All at the same time, all this stuff is coming out.
Yeah.
Literally minute after minute, there's a new band coming, and they're really good. Every single one of them. It's crazy, And so I would say most people in that time period liked all of that. So they liked the Poisons and they liked the Testaments. They liked the Cinderellas and the Motley Crues, but they also liked the Overkills and they also liked the Death Angels. There was not a lot of, oh, I can't listen to that. There was some of it, but I don't think there was
That's
a lot.
what I'm going to name my band, the Motley Crues.
The Motley Crue. So anyhow, that was my next one. So what do you got for your fourth one?
All right. So my next one is going to be Scorpions Blackout. So there, obviously Scorpions had been around for a while at this point. Released 7 other albums. And to me, though, this is where Scorpions becomes the Scorpions that most people know and love. I mean, you think back to 1972, they're releasing, psychedelic rock albums with Lonesome Crow, they Fly to the Rainbow. It wasn't really until, I would say, Virgin Killer where they started to kind of establish their sound. Love Drive, obviously, is a big one. But in that time, they've also got Turmoil, where they've got Uli John Roth as their primary guitar player. They bring in Michael Schenker to I guess fill in the ranks basically. You have them bringing on Klaus, not Klaus. What the hell? You have them bringing on Matthias Jabs, and then really bringing Michael back, and then bringing Matthias back. A lot of changes, and then they hit Blackout in 1982, and this is where the band hits their biggest singles. No One Like You, Blackout. This is what leads into the stuff that came on Love at First Sting, like Rock You Like a Hurricane, Big City Nights, etc. But Blackout was where they really just took off. It was certified gold and then later platinum. I mean, this was the change and the lineup that kind of set in stone that would still really be playing today for the most part. I mean, you have a change in Herman Rarebell's no longer playing, right? You have Francis Buchholz that's been fired since because of whatever happened with behind the scenes with the band. But other than that, you have Klaus, you have Rudolph, and Matthias, all still that core lineup of the band. And this is a huge step forward from the stuff that came before. Love Drive, Animal Magnetism. I love those albums. Don't get me wrong. Even Taken by Force is a great album. That was the last one with Uli John Roth. But when I think of Scorpions, I mean, for me, the first song that comes into mind is No One Like You. That opening from No One Like You. And even then after that, probably Rock You Like a Hurricane, but this album just allowed them to blow up. I mean, it was multiple times rated like a 10/10 album, 5 stars, etc. It's just, to me, it's incredible.
That's what this whole debate is about, because if it would have been me and I'm picking the Scorpions album, I probably, by the title, career defining album, I'm going with Love at First Sting. But I'm also well aware that this album, established them on the map. Like,
Mhm.
they obviously had a career beforehand. They had a successful career, mostly in Europe and mostly in Japan. With Uli as their lead guitar player all the way up until Virgin Killer, when that album came out, and then Animal Magnetism comes out, and then Love Drive comes out, and Love Drive is a different band now. Now we have Michael's back in the fold, Matthias is in there, and obviously, and Rudy's still the rhythm guitar player. So they're trying to they've kind of established a lane that they want to be in with Animal Magnetism. They kind of widen the highway with Love Drive, but then this album comes out, Blackout, and it's just like, holy shit, this album's really good.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic album, and the cover is cool, the video, and Rudy looking like the guy on the cover, because that's not the same person. Actually, the artist who did the cover, that's supposed to be like a self-portrait, but Rudy looks so much like him that they used Rudy in the video to look like him. It's crazy that this album is so good, and then you think about Love at First Sting, that much better. It's crazy to think
Yeah, I
about.
mean, it's definitely one where I can see the debate on either side. For me, I think of it as like what made them, I guess, made the world kind of open their eyes to the band, right? And
Mhm.
so you could easily say either one.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely. Like I said, it's one of those, like, when you go by the definition of what we're trying to talk about, I would have picked Love at First Sting, because it,
Yeah.
it it defined their career. But at the same time, Blackout could easily, like you're saying, define that career, because it set the path. I mean, they were on the path, but then all of a sudden it's like, boom, the doors are open.
Because
You
they
know,
didn't really change their style for Love at First Sting either. Like they established what they were going to do, and they really did just more of the same, but they were really good songs on Love at First Sting.
right?
So
Exactly.
that's kind of where I would say like the debate is 100% like there. Like there is a debate for that.
Exactly. There absolutely is. And it's very similar. So I'm going to go into the next song, the next album that I'm going to do, and it's going to have that same kind of debate. We talked about this right before we started recording. Queensryche. I'm picking Empire, their 1990 release, because to me, yes, Operation Mindcrime opened the doors enough for them to break through, I guess you could say. But Empire is just, they just literally put the stamp down, and they said, "Here we are." And this is the band that we are now, because they changed every album. They were different every album, and then Empire comes out, and they hit the mainstream. And that's, to me, where that the career defining album definition comes into. They hit the mainstream. And you know there's an argument to be made that it happened with Operation Mindcrime, but
Yeah.
but was Operation Mindcrime mainstream enough? That's the question.
I,
That's the
I, I guess it's a fair question because yeah, it's probably not, and it's probably more that it's become a cult album where
right.
there's this huge following of the album. Obviously Jeff, when he left the band, he made a band called Operation Mindcrime. After he was forced to no longer use the Queensryche name. So I get that, and they even did the sequel to Operation Mindcrime too. So it has this iconicness that I think when I think of Queensryche and there's that association with the album. Even though for me, like I much prefer say Rage for Order, or even The Warning to either of those albums that we're talking about right now.
Right, exactly. I completely agree with you in that regards.
Yeah, but
You know,
Empire, you're right. Like they have Empire, Silent Lucidity, and that Silent Lucidity is one of those moments that like really blew them up, right? Because it has the music video and everything with it, and then Jet City Woman.
right.
So this, I would agree with you for the most part, even though like I kind of question it, saying like, isn't Operation Mindcrime kind of that moment that established them as some, it was a gold album, right? When pretty much right away within a year.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so I mean, it still got them that notoriety, but I think Empire just did that much better.
Yeah, I mean, overall, Operation Mindcrime, became a platinum album, but Empire was a triple platinum album, and
Exactly. Yeah.
and it's triple platinum based on the strength of Silent Lucidity. Let's not kid ourselves. The song Empire and the song Just City Woman are not making this a triple platinum album. It can make it a platinum album based on the strength coming off of Operation Mindcrime, but it's not making it triple until Silent Lucidity hit the airwaves, and MTV blew it up, the radio blew it up, and it was over at that point. It's
Yeah.
game was game set match type of thing. That's the reason why I picked Empire. I mean, I was a fan since the Warning. So, for me, I could see the progression, the Warning, Rage for Order. Rage for Order was just so different from the Warning, but yet, I appreciate that album more now today than I did back in 1986. Okay, and I was a big fan of it in '86. Okay, then Operation Mindcrime comes out, and it's like I'm like the emoji head fucking blown because it's so different. At the same time, it's so progressive. At the same time, it's this concept album, like it's a true story from beginning to end, and each song literally is the next part of the story, and they have these interludes in between that kind of add to it. Not the same kind of concept that Pink Floyd put out with The Wall, because that was just hard to follow at times, but this one is literally a story beginning to end, and it's so there. And even then, when you get to the end of the story, did she or didn't she kind of thing,
Yeah.
there's so much to question. I mean, for years people asked that question, what happened to Mary? Did she or didn't she? And it's a crazy thing. They answered it, and they just, they say, listen to the song, you'll get it, it's there. But man, um it was, and that album did it, but I think it was more for the actual scene that it did it, Operation Mindcrime, whereas Empire hit the mainstream, and that's the big difference for me.
Yeah, I get that.
Okay, so what's your album number 5?
So this is another band I don't think we've really mentioned too much on the show. I want to talk about Living Color with their album Vivid. So, I mean, this was a really big album. It's been or it's become double platinum since it came out. It was number 6 on the Billboard 200, and it was something different. The metal scene really, let's be honest, it still is predonomantly a oh, let's say white
Caucasian.
Caucasian, yeah. Um, there's a lot of people that even came from other countries and kind of were white passing. But this was a band that was, African American black guys that put out a funk metal album that is just awesome, and it really like kind of puts the genre on its head in some ways, where these guys that would do something different, like say Rage Against the Machine, um, that would try something different, that would stand out, that still were able to be on the scene. Anthrax even did their combo with Public Enemy, where I think a lot of people said this can't work, and it does. I don't enjoy all rap metal, and I wouldn't say this is really rap metal by any means, but it is different than what you hear from a lot of stuff that was coming out at the time for an album that came out in 1988. there's a lot of really avant-garde kind of stuff going on. It's very artsy in a lot of ways. It's got jazz elements, soul, funk, I mean pop, punk. I mean it's got a lot of things going on, and it's still really heavy. I mean, Cult of Personality, if you're a wrestling fan, you know that song because of CM Punk, right? But there's a lot of really good stuff on the album. I mean, Middleman is a really cool song. Um, Open Letter to a Landlord. So you're getting a different perspective than a lot of the other stuff. And these guys earned every bit of it. So I was a fan for a long time, even before I heard CM Punk use the song. I remember the first time. I mean, he was using it prior to my knowledge of him. Um, but I remember the first time I heard it, I was like, "What?" You know, because when he first went to WWE, he didn't use this song. He used it was This Fire, I think is what it's called from what's that band? Um J- Jesse Leach is the singer.
Oh, Kill Switch Engage.
Killswitch Engage, yes. So he was using that for the longest time, and then they allowed him to use his Cult of Personality song that he had used when he was in Ring of Honor. And I hadn't really ever seen him before, his WWE time. So um, that was like one of those moments where it's like, oh, this is a song that I know from my childhood that's being put on TV in such a major platform. And for me, like I was a big fan of this album. I didn't get into as much of the stuff that went on from there because they went more into like the kind of jazzy funk stuff. It was the albums that followed weren't quite as heavy. But I think Vivid is one of those albums that it appealed to a lot of people that maybe not or didn't really see from that perspective. It was kind of the white men can't jump effect where, that movie was able to broadly appeal to a lot of different uh, groups of people. And so like I thought this was a freaking cool album, and I still listen to it every once in a while to this day.
So, you know, Run DMC does a collaboration with Aerosmith. Right? And
Yes.
they do Walk This Way, and it becomes a big hit. It basically gave a second life to Aerosmith. Um, that was a band that I had the choice, for the career defining albums. To me, they have two different careers, and so there was two different albums I could have picked. So that's why I didn't choose them.
But yeah, that's a good one to mention though, because it's one of those songs, Walk This Way, that like it became cool in multiple groups of people, right? Like it became cool like if you were into rap, like that was kind of a cool song. It had, it's like, oh man, these guys ain't so bad, right?
Right, exactly.
And,
Yeah,
and it from our side, as far as like metal guys, and is from like rap guys, right? So with bands that were able to kind of like bridge the genres, I think opened up a lot of like I anytime I went to a show that had um like different genres than what I was used to, like it didn't really matter. Like it was always interesting to me because you see like a different audience. Like I've been to shows where like say Yngwie Malmsteen. I went to a show, I don't know, at this point, let's see, probably about 10 years ago, and it was so funny to me because everybody there was, was so calm. It was like, oh yeah, I'm really excited to see him. I got to get to bed at 9 o'clock because
they all had pirate shirts on. That's
they
what
were
happened.
all elderly, right? And so, but then I went to shows like where there was a contrasting opening and closing act, or maybe the headliner had kind of one crowd and the acts that came before had a different crowd. And so you see this kind of like division sometimes. But then I've been to shows like um where what was it, Prophets of Rage, where you saw like all different kinds of people and they're all like we're just all chilling together. It was cool. So I never got to see Living Color in person. I missed the opportunity right around COVID. So hopefully I get that, but I've always been interested to just go and see a band one that I like, but also like that in just a different, interesting audience.
So, adding to the point I was trying to get at,
Mm-hmm.
you have Run DMC does this collaboration with Aerosmith, right? Which then leads into Anthrax doing that collaboration with Public Enemy. Okay. And those are the kinds of things that, a lot of people on the surface say, that doesn't work. We can't
Yeah,
have that. Okay. Why are you doing that? Why are you trying to cross this barrier? Okay. And the artists themselves are saying, what's your problem? Screw that. If I want to work with this guy, I work with this guy. If I want to do this, I do that. You can't tell me what to do. Right. So then you get a band like Living Color. Okay. If it's not for Living Color, if it's not for Run DMC doing Aerosmith, Public Enemy doesn't hang out with Anthrax, right? Because the idea is just never there, right? Maybe it does happen, but it maybe happens differently. But then you got a band like Living Color. Like if they don't form a band, if they don't form an all African American band, right? Then you don't get a band like Rage Against the Machine that is a mix of so many different personalities and so many different cultures, right? Because you get a guy like Zach, and then he's hanging out with a guy like Tim Comerford. Two different. I mean, Tim's a big white guy. Zach is Hispanic. Maybe I think he's also part African American. I can't remember right off the top of my head. I can look it up in a sec. Then you have Tom Morello, African American guy who goes to Harvard, right? And he's playing this incredible guitar that you don't even understand how he's doing half of what he's doing. Brad Wilk, I don't know, that dude's just freak drummer.
yeah.
So it's like without Living Color, that probably doesn't happen. And it's the reason being, regardless of the fact that Rage Against the Machine is not all African American, the bottom line is that because Living Color was able to break through into the mainstream and people saw, oh, hey, I could do this too. I could play that kind of music, or I could be like that guy, right? Then all of a sudden you take your little influences here. Well, yeah, I could be that guy, but I grew up with this, so I can kind of mix this all together. And that's how bands like that happen. And Living Color is amazing to me. I never really got too deep into Living Color because when they came out with their second album and it didn't do so well, they kind of just fell off the wagon for me, I guess you could say. But I've always loved that first album. And Open Letter to a Landlord. I don't really think I've heard Middleman in probably since the first time I heard the album. So because I don't listen to the album that much, but obviously Open Letter to a Landlord was the next single after that, and it was pretty big. Not huge like Cult of Personality, but it was still pretty good. Glamour Boys was another one. So if without this album setting the tone, I guess you put it that way, lots of other things don't happen. And this album's great. This definitely gave them a career.
Oh, for sure. I mean, even to this day, I think a lot of the people that go to see them is probably based around this album. I mean, the Cult of Personality alone was it best hard rock performance in 1990. That's what they're Grammys for. So, it's one of those things where I like music that has perspective to it. And it's not just, you know, it's not just talking about sex and drugs and all that stuff that I said at the beginning of the show. I like when a band is able to put, say, their personal experiences into their music, and you can hear a lot more depth to it. I also like the fantasy stuff, like that are, say Judas Priest, like they have lots of layers to them as a band where they're singing sometimes about, a fantastical superhero that's going to save the world, and then the next song is about, not being able to get a job and feeling angry and fighting against the system. So there's always those layers to everything that you want out of music. But it's nice to hear somebody's perspective and put um into a poetic sense and not so upfront and just smacking you over the face with it like some modern music that I feel does, where it's just there's no subtleness to a lot of stuff we hear today, where it's putting it right out there. Like, it's hard for me to respect a song called WAP, you know, when the it's just gutter filth. and,
Yeah.
and and we're not getting like really poetic, amazing songs that we used to get. So
I don't call that artistry. It's a song. I mean, you are a creative artist, but I don't consider that artistry. It's definitely not a Van Gogh. It's a street art, if you want to put it that way.
yeah.
So, and that's being nice. So, um, my number five album is going to be Anthrax and Among the Living, 1987. All
Uh-huh.
right, so we just mentioned Anthrax doing their collaboration with Public Enemy. Among the Living, if you want to talk, this is almost like if you look up career defining album in the dictionary or the encyclopedia or Wikipedia, this is the album that should be plastered all over that, because I don't think, and Guns N' Roses might be running right behind. I don't think there's another band that just lives off of that one album more than Anthrax does.
I
And I
think
don't
I think Anthrax more so than Guns N' Roses, because Guns N' Roses at least has Use Your Illusion 1 and 2. And I'm not saying that Anthrax doesn't have good albums, but they play almost this full album every show.
Well, and that's what I'm talking about, because it's funny because they live off of this album, but they have so many more albums. They have so many more good songs that it's mind-boggling that they don't play them. But at the same time, like when we saw them recently, they were a headliner. They had a good set, and they played, you know, I Am the Law. They played Indians. They played Caught in a Mosh. Um, I think they played only one other song from the album, so they only played four. But it feels like the whole thing is based on this album. They did a good set.
They didn't play Among the Living? I thought they did.
No, I don't think they played Among the Living.
Hmm.
Well, maybe they did. Maybe they opened up with that. I'm not sure. Yes. You know what? You're right. So yeah, they played four songs, 4 or 5 tops. But still, they played, I think, 15 songs that night. So it's a third of their
That's
set.
a third of the show.
Right.
Yeah.
But you know what? You're not gonna play half the songs off of time. It just doesn't work that way for them. Spreading the Disease is probably the next most big album that they have. And they've got probably good 3 songs. I think they played 2 off of that album. But the
I
thing
think
is,
one off of they just played Death Rider, right? Off of
no, they play Metal Threshing Man.
Oh, that's right, they did. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's funny because when they're not headlining, you might as well call it the Among the Living show, because it's like out of the 10 songs that they typically get to play, or 8 songs, it's two-thirds or 3/4 of it come from Among the Living. Um, but you know what? At the same time, I would do the same thing, because you know what? That album is damn good.
Yeah, they're
You know,
good songs.
it's a great album. I remember when this album came out, I was blown away. I'm like, wow, this is awesome. I mean, I was a big Metallica fan, so Metallica comes out with Master of Puppets, Slayer comes out with Rain and Blood, Megadeth comes out with, Peace, I think Peace Cells came out in 86. Yeah. It come out with Peace Cells. And so the last of the big four was Anthrax. And they turned this around at the beginning of 1987, and it's like, wow, okay, so yeah, they thrashed it out. This was a great album. I mean, beginning to end, this is just a banger. And I've come to appreciate side 2 so much more over the last several years, because there's some really good stuff on the second half of the album. Especially when they toured recently and they played the whole album front to back, but they actually did it where they changed the track list around because they had to do that for what term they had to do it in terms of being able to have the good songs towards the end. Otherwise, they were going to be closing with the fucking a piece of shit song. At the end, that is not as good. It's not as good as "I Am the Law" or "Indians."
Yeah.
And I mean, not say a piece of shit song because all the songs on the album are good, but it's not. I think it's Horror of It All. Can't remember what the last album is. The last song is
Imitation of Life.
Imitation Life. You don't want to end the show on that song. I think,
No, it's not the best.
Like when Metallica did the Black Album beginning to end, they literally did end to beginning, and it going backwards makes that album perfect for a concert setting. It's pretty awesome, especially if you play it in the middle, like you play a few songs first and then you start from the last song all the way to Enter Sandman. It's pretty interesting how that lays itself out.
That's cool.
But what are your thoughts on Among the Living?
I mean, pretty much everything you said. Like it's one of those albums it's definitely landmark for them. They don't have the capability, let's say, of playing much of the 4 albums that they kind of exhumed from their category. I mean, from their catalog, right? Basically because Joey doesn't want to play anything from the John Bush era, and luckily they play Only. But that's probably a huge negotiation between him and Scott. So
Yeah, that's just bullshit. You know what? Play the fucking song, sing it. God damn it.
But yeah, I mean, it's their biggest album. It's a great album, back to front, front to back, whatever. I'm trying to think because you said back to front, right? So,
right.
like, if you start with Imitation of Life and end with Among the Living, it's certainly better.
Yes.
Like for a concert, So yeah, I mean, I'll totally agree. This is their career defining album, period. And you might be able to argue, depending on what you think about it, because their second career may be Sound of White Noise. But as a whole, if you're looking at their entire catalog, of course, Among the Living is their bread and butter.
Oh no, absolutely, it's their bread and butter. I mean, if you were going to go, let's say John era, and that's your career defining moment, yeah, it's going to be Sound of White Noise.
Yeah.
To me, the Sound of White Noise is the career change. I got fired from my previous job. Now I'm going to start a whole new career.
Yeah.
So this is, I'm going from being a salesman to IT. It's just like, wow. I mean, it was such a change, but it was good. I'm not going to complain about that. All right, so let's get into the last 2 albums that we had to do for the night.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about Paranoid from Black Sabbath. So as much as the first album was like that moment that sparked what metal would be in the future, I think Paranoid is where like the blueprints of heavy metal really kind of took form. You have War Pigs, Paranoid, Planet Caravan, Iron Man. I mean, Iron Man alone, like, just think about, the stuff that would emulate a lot of what they did on that track. But Electric Funeral, Hand of Doom, Fairies Wear Boots. I mean, even Rat Salad, the instrumental, like from beginning to end, this is a metal album. You could still consider it hard rock for sure, but this to me is one of the first heavy metal albums. And it's only, I mean, it's in the same year essentially. It's only what, like 10 months later from the previous album.
Yes.
So I mean, what a evolution to step forward into the next level.
Not even 10 months. Because the other one came out in February of 70. This one came out in September.
Yeah, I'm thinking more of like when it was recorded, right? So October of 69 to September, right?
Right.
So Approximately
Well,
12,
so that's
11, 12 months.
right,
Yeah.
and that's recording to releasing as
Oh,
opposed to
that's
recording
true
to
because it's
recording.
recording to recording is even less. Yeah, 6 months.
So yeah,
So,
it's crazy.
so, um, so many bands cite just pretty much any song that I just list. You throw a dart at a list of them, and you'll find a song that's inspired somebody. Um, just absolutely incredible step forward into what metal would become. And if you look at their career, the first six albums are nearly flawless. You have Master of Reality, following it, Volume 4, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. I don't think there's that step forward in all of those albums, like from the first to the second album. The first album makes you go like open your eyes. Oh my god, what is this? And then Paranoid hits, and it's like, oh my god, this is metal. This is the archetype of what we be going forward.
Yeah,
And as much as I love all the albums that follow, Master of Reality, Volume 4, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, Sabotage, and then I'm not as we've talked about Technical Ecstasy in the past. We've talked about Never Say Die. Then you go into the Ronnie James Dio era, and you've got that Heaven and Hell, Mob Rules. That's a pretty stellar track record for your first 10, 12 albums, right? Just absolutely incredible. Um, but something about Paranoid as that step forward, as that moment of just like nearly perfect album from beginning to end. I think Paranoid stands out from the pack in that way.
when you listen to Black Sabbath, the first album, right? You hear they're still kind of like a bluesy jam band.
Mhm.
Okay, they have some heavy stuff. Obviously, Black Sabbath, the song. You have uh, the Wizard, right? But you listen to that second side. You listen to Sleeping Village or Behind the Wall of Sleep and all these different um, songs that they do. It's they're kind of like they're just jamming along. They're bopping along. It's not what Paranoid would be. Paranoid was such a move forward, and it was so consistent. Like the consistency was not there anywhere on Black Sabbath, the first album. Paranoid, on the other hand, is so consistent. It's so direct. War Pigs. Who would have thought that all these years later, War Pigs would be a pretty much a mainstream song? Everybody knows that freaking song. Everybody knows Paranoid. Everybody knows Iron Man. You know, and it's like, wow, these songs are so good. I actually heard Iron Man the other day, and I'm like, I don't remember it sounding like this. It was so much more distorted sounding than I had remembered because I hadn't heard it like the Black Sabbath version on my stereo in my car in such a long time.
Mhm.
And I was like, oh wow, this is really heavy, you know. And then I heard Paranoid on the weekend. One of the kids playing the guitars in a showcase that my daughter was in played Paranoid, and they were just playing the riffs. And I'm like,
The one riff.
yeah, it was just ding, so it was so funny because they're playing that, and the teacher was playing along with them, you know. Dan, 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 they're playing that over and over and over again, right? But it was heavy, and listening to the version, the Black Sabbath version, it's so different than anything that was coming out at the time in 1970. I mean, Led Zeppelin, they were trying to do similar songs, not overall, but like let's for instance, Immigrant Song or what's the other song? Not Good Times, Bad Times. What was the song on the first album? Communication Breakdown. But it didn't have the same tone that Black Sabbath has. It you could tell that distortion was such a distinguishing difference between the two bands that that's why Black Sabbath is considered to be the godfathers of heavy metal because of their tone, because of their sound, and
Yeah.
because it's the songs, right? So this album is just amazing. War Pigs, Paranoid, like you mentioned, Planet Caravan, Iron Man, Electric Funeral, all of them. Fairies Wear Boots is a great song. I love that song. This is a great album. 8 songs, in and out, boom, in 41 minutes. It's great, beginning to end. I remember in high school, just going to the park, hanging out with some friends, listening to an import cassette of this album, and we just listened to it front to back. Like, this is so freaking good, So
It's an absolute classic.
I'll take it every day. Okay, so for me, my last album for the night is going to be Kiss Alive. That is the standard bearer for what Kiss became, because before that, the 3 albums were good, but this album was better. Kiss Alive, for whatever someone's going to sit there and say, oh, they re-recorded all the tracks, or the only thing that was live was Peter. You know what? I don't care. You know why? Because this is one damn good album. You can still feel the energy that comes off of this vinyl every time it's played. Vinyl, CD, cassette, whatever. The energy explodes off of this thing. I mean, the songs are played different. And it's not because they're the guitar tone. There's the attitude behind each of these songs and how they're played in concert is so different. It was finally captured what Kiss was all about. Rock and Roll All Night became a single and became the rock and roll national anthem. But it was still, I mean, an album before that, you heard it on Dress to Kill, and it's okay. It's not the great song. But then you add the guitar solo in it, and just the vibe of that whole album is what established Kiss and allowed them career defining. If it wasn't for this album, they don't have a career, period. They're done. The record company was done. Kiss was done. It was all done. Everybody's going broke. Neil Bogart's going broke. The 4 guys in Kiss are going broke. Bill Aucoin is going broke. They all were all in. Literally, they put all the chips in, and they won. They flipped the ace card. That's amazing. And it gave Kiss a career. They were able to do Destroyer. They were able to do Rock and Roll Over, Love Gun, and so forth. And then they decided to almost kill their own career, 4 years later. So what did you think of Kiss Alive?
I mean, I didn't hear it obviously until much later, much later, because I wasn't really much of a Kiss fan growing up. Right, this also came out years before I was born, so it's a different perspective. But looking at it and kind of knowing the story behind it is really interesting. Absolutely, you're right. It saved their career. It started a fresh new career for them. In a lot of the way that again, to reference Judas Priest, Judas Priest does Unleashed in the East, and it kind of gives their old songs a fresh new flavor, right? This does this in a lot of ways. It sounds live. So there's no question there of like what their intent is. It sounds like this, if you come to our show, this is what you're going to get, rather than necessarily what's on the studio recording. And I would liken that again to Unleashed in the East is, by the time that album came out, the instrumentation was a little bit different. Things were a bit heavier and more full of sound. And that's the same here, where everything sounds a bit better than it did before. Not saying that the earlier recordings are not good, but there's just something magic here about like the live sound, and this is the performance you'll be expecting when you go to see them live. And I think it enticed a lot of people, the glitz and glamour. You had mentioned, you saw a commercial, and you were just blown away visually of what Kiss was doing. Well, this is the album that captures that visual appeal. And how do you capture visual appeal in a a gatefold album? Well, they presented it in just the right way that saved their career and allowed them to become a persistent force in music all these years.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, while you were talking about something, like several live albums during the 70s established many people's careers. Kiss Alive in 75, Kiss Alive 2 in 77. Peter Frampton Comes Alive. What was it? From Live and Dangerous, from Thin Lizzy, UFO, Strangers in the Night. All those albums basically blew up these bands. And UFO was pretty big, but Strangers in the Night is established as one of the greatest live albums of all time, right?
Yeah,
But
next level.
so what I started thinking about what you were talking about certain things was what was it that it captured? What was it that happened? Well, I'll tell you now that I think about it. So you have all these really good songs that were on the first Kiss album. You have all these really good songs that are on Hotter Than Hell, and you have these good songs that are on Dress to Kill. The problem was that they had three different production qualities, right? They had two different producers on the three albums because the first two were produced by the same people. But the first one and the second one, a completely different sound, right? What Kiss Alive did was unify the sound for all those songs. So now they're being played with the same guitars, they're being played with the same amps, they're being played with the same energy from beginning to end. Obviously the notes are different and all that stuff, but they're being played in such a way that they all unify, and and you realize, damn, all these songs are good. Right. And it's the same thing with all the other bands that established. Like, why did Peter Frampton all of a sudden become a household name because of Frampton Comes Alive? What was the difference between the song? I never really heard the studio recording to sit there and say, because all I ever hear is the damn live version of his songs.
Yeah. I'm in the same boat. I've never really heard anything else.
I mean, same thing with Cheap Trick. Cheap Trick, the song that defines their career is "I Want You to Want Me," right?
Yes.
Well, what's the big difference? The live version is played the way they want it, where the studio version had piano on it. It had a light drum. It didn't sound like anything like the live version, right? But the live version, they did it the way they wanted to, the way they actually played it, and people loved it. So producers fucked that one up. But Kiss Alive, it unified the songs. That's the one thing I got out of it. I was like, now all the songs, not that they sound the same, because you don't want them to sound the same, but they all had the same that vibrant energy, and that was what made that amazing.
Yeah.
So I was just like, I heard that. Now, mind you, the first one I heard was Kiss Alive 2, but this is the one that gave them a career to be able to do Kiss Alive 2. So that tells you that.
Absolutely.
All right, so to mention a couple of albums that we could have mentioned tonight and talked about, obviously there's a few glaring omissions, and I don't want to leave them out, but an album we kind of briefly touched upon in the band, Guns N' Roses, Appetite for Destruction. I mean, if there wasn't an album that set the tone for someone's career, I don't know what is. Debatable, AC/DC's Back in Black, because some people will sit there and say, oh, no, it was Highway to Hell. Yeah, but Highway to Hell ended someone's career, and Back in Black began someone else's career, so
I think you could easily make an argument for both, but Back in Black maybe a little more so, because if they had not, recruited Brian Johnson and made Back in Black immediately after in the way they did, they would not have exploded in the way they did. So
exactly. Bon Jovi, Slippery When Wet, that defines Bon Jovi's career to this day. Living on a Prayer, Wanted Dead or Alive, we hear them every day on the radio. Okay, Runaway was a breakout hit, but their second album, kind of a sophomore slump. All they had was what the hell was that song, In and Out of Love. It was their big hit off that second album. That just kept the momentum until Slippery When Wet came. And then, when Bon Jovi and Richie Sambora met Desmond Child, it was game over. Def Leppard, Hysteria. An argument can be made for Pyromania. Iron Maiden, Number the Beast. That to me is the turning point of their career. That's career defining at that point.
I would agree. I mean, for them, you know, switching singers and releasing an album as big as they did, you know, that's one of those things. Like they increased in their scope after, you know, changing singers, and that's a tough one because you have an established fan base. It's somehow you grew from there. So I would say that's like their moment. You know, it was either make or break in a lot of ways.
Exactly. It was definitely make or break because we're like, all right, we're changing singers. We got to do something, and
Mhm.
it's literally we're changing singers. If it doesn't work on this one, we're fucked. You
Pretty
know?
much, yeah.
So Twisted Sister, Stay Hungry, Sepultura, Chaos AD. These albums defined their careers because Twisted Sister had gotten a record contract and they had continued their career. But essentially, at that point they were still a freaking bar band out of New York. But Stay Hungry put them on the map. Stay Hungry, we're not going to take it. And I Want to Rock made them MTV darlings.
Yeah.
And then they screwed it all up the next two albums. Sepultura, KSAD. I mean, it had established them as an international act, and allowed them to make roots. So, that definitely is career defining. Everything changed after Chaos AD for them. Let's see a couple other names here. I mean, Metallica. Which album from Metallica? To me, the Black Album, career defining. Everyone sits there and say, "Oh, well, Master of Puppets." Nah, I don't think so. I really don't, because they kind of continued that trend with And Justice for All. They made another banger of an album, but they changed the game when the Black Album came out.
I mean, I would agree. My second choice is obviously Lulu, but
Leave my
yeah.
dog alone. And there's countless other bands. The argument can be made. Whitesnake, is it the 1987 album or is it Slide It In? Because Slide It In, they changed from what they were, and to the point where the record company was so happy with the album, they said, you know what, we need a better mix, and they brought it and they got a US mix, and that changed the game for them. They went from being an extremely heavy blues based rock band, Deep Purple-ish, to being the band that they would eventually become an album later. Obviously 1987 changed the game, but I don't know. An argument can be made between Slide It In and Whitesnake, that album.
I think Whitesnake, if I'm going to pick one of the two.
Right.
Honestly, because it had the hits. It had the music videos.
Right. Exactly.
Slide It In is great, but like it's that moment that even we talked about it before with David Coverdale. Like he was always trying to, break America, and that's the album that broke America, and it did exactly what he wanted. It had the music videos with Tawny Katane. Like if you think about Whitesnake, like there's that you think about Tawny Katane, you know, and that's the music video. Here I go again, that version, you know.
Right. Exactly. I'm looking at the recording thing. Okay, it's reconnected. Okay. So last but not least, I want to before, when you were talking about Tony Katane and Whitesnake and all that, yes. The Slide It In album, to me, I guess you could look at it as a bridge from the old Whitesnake to what the new Whitesnake would become. So last but not least, I wanted to mention Aerosmith, because we talked about it briefly earlier in the show. To me, they have two defining, career defining albums. To me, Toys in the Attic is what made them a household name in the 70s.
Mhm.
They destroyed their career. They were nearly completely useless as a band heading into the beginning of the 80s. They reunited in the mid 80s with Joe Perry, and then they come out with Let the Music Do, Done with Mirrors, which the big song was Let the Music Do the Talking, which was actually a Joe Perry project song. That gave them their career again, and then uh they gave them their record contract again, and then they come out with Permanent Vacation. Permanent Vacation did really, really, really well, but to me, the one that just really made Aerosmith loved all over again was Pump. That's my second, for them, their second career defining record. And then after that, they had, they became what they are now. So, is there
Yeah,
any
I mean, for them, that was a tough one because they've had, like you said, two different careers, and
right?
I mean, they kind of disappeared and then came back in a massive way, massive way. I even remember what was the album that they did that had all the Aerosmith songs. The what was the Armageddon?
All
They
of them.
had all
They all had Aerosmith songs.
yeah the
um,
Armageddon songs. Just
oh,
push play. That was even in some ways a career redefining album. So they've had multiple moments in their career where it was like they've established themselves to multiple generations.
yes. Is there any other albums you want to mention?
Honestly, not really. I think for the most part we covered it, and even we've mentioned other ones as we were kind of going. I mean, Judas Priest. We like. I guess I can wrap things up with them. You could easily make an argument for British Steel or Screaming for Vengeance as their kind of career-defining album. I think there's two schools of thought there, where British Steel is an absolutely huge album, really put them on the map, but then you mentioned the same thought that I had was they followed it up with Point of Entry, and then when they hit uh, Screaming for Vengeance, they never looked back from there. So, you know, to me, that's kind of the defining, like, they really established themselves as a metal band rather than just like a, hard rock slash metal band. Like, Screaming for Vengeance to me is like true heavy metal. So,
Right, exactly the way I feel. Okay, so that brings us to our big four. And our big four tonight is the big four life changing albums for us, for you and I. Um, that is, these are very, very personal to us. So these 8 albums that we're going to discuss is what really made us, I would assume, was what made us metalheads. So, uh, I went first last week, so it's your turn to go first.
I mean, to some degree, yes. And I think about this. Where did I get my love for metal? And there's a few things, and I would say a lot of it came from 80s cartoons. A lot of them had like metal kind of soundtracks. And then, TV shows like the Power Rangers was very um metal as a kid. Like everything was guitar sweep arpeggios and stuff, like things that just made me so hype, right? And I found myself wanting heavier and heavier stuff as I got older, but I think a lot of that evolved from kids shows in the 80s, 80s, 90s.
That's disturbing.
Why?
I'm
It's
just kidding.
it's great. So, but yeah, so starting from my number 4, is it's a compilation album, and I got this. I don't know, in the late '90s, I think. Um, it was in one of those. What do you call it? Like what was you ordered the CDs and you got like 15 for a nickel.
Columbia House.
Columbia House, right? This thing was called Rock and the Train Kept a Rollin'. And listen to what's on it. So, Killing in the Name by Rage Against the Machine, Wood, Alice in Chains, Black from Pearl Jam, Runaway Train from Soul Asylum, No More Tears, Ozzy Osbourne, Cult of Personality, Living Color, um, Learning to Fly from Pink Floyd, Don't Stop Believin' from Journey, Breaking the Law, Judas Priest, Pump It Up, Elvis Costello, Surrender from Cheap Trick, Cat Scratch Fever, Ted Nugent, Walk This Way, Aerosmith, Don't Fear the Reaper, Blue Oyster Cult, More Than a Feeling, Boston, and I could go on. There's all these really cool singles that a lot of the stuff I wasn't like really super familiar with. It even had like I Ain't Superstitious by Jeff Beck. So it got me into a lot of things that I had never really listened to before. There was other crap on there that I didn't like, so I'm not going to mention those. But some of these bands I don't know if I would have heard as early in my life, like Alice in Chains. Um, was kind of off my radar because I was so young, and the stuff that my parents listened to was so different. So finding albums like this sometimes were a gateway for me to find more bands. Um, and so, as silly as the album title is, and it being a compilation, I think this was a huge impact on me. My number three is Death Human. When I heard Lack of Comprehension the first time, um, it was like a catharsis. Like it was one of those moments where you just go like, what am I listening to? I have to have this album now. Human was, not my favorite album from the band. That I think probably Symbolic probably still is my favorite album from Death. But Human was just one of those things. Like I think going back to the career defining albums, A Human was one of those that like it bridged the mainstream. It had their music video played by MTV. It was one of like it appeared on um Beavis and Butthead. So, just having that ability to have the mainstream appeal, and it opened like my ears up to just the heaviness that I always kind of craved. So Death Human just super impactful on me. My number two is In Flames Clayman. And I cite this one because it was a moment like finding melodic death metal for me was just it was like eye opening. In Flames led me to several other bands, but it wasn't until Clayman where my mind was just blown. I also met one of my best friends because of this album. I had seen them, and I was wearing a T-shirt from the tour of this show. I mean, of this album, and he walked up to me and goes, "Ah, Clayman, it's a great album. They suck now, but it's a great album." And just that kind of interaction really made us friends, and it was just my friend George to this day, known him for God 20 years. So I would say definitely impactful on my life. And my number one is going to be Metallica and Justice for All. That was an album I found kind of early into my metal um history, I guess. And I remember the first time I heard the intro to Blackened, and I was like, what is this? What am I listening to? This, reverse harmony. What am I have to have this. And I listened to Blackened probably about 20 times. I was borrowing it on a friend's CD player and just listening to it over and over and over again. And it was my gateway into like, bigger and better things when it came to metal for me. I was a huge Metallica fan for a long time, and I think a lot of people have that same kind of experience where they find Metallica and then it leads them into other genres of metal as well because they are such a accessible band that for me it was like that moment of like, yes, I'm finally finding something that sounds like the stuff that I want to hear. Where do I get more of this? And so it's always kind of been one of those albums that I have to give so much credit for in my metal genesis.
Oh, sounds cool. I like that. Everything that you've listed here, kind of, I can totally see, except maybe the rock and the train kept it rolling. But I
You don't like
understand.
the songs that are
Oh no,
listed?
no, that's why I can understand. It's just the title's so weird.
The
Um,
title's so dumb, and I remember a friend of mine laughing at it, like, what is this? And then I started listing off the songs that were on, and he goes, okay, I get it.
right. Yeah. No, the songs on there is outstanding songs. So it can easily. influence you in a certain way. And a compilation like that is how I got to know Y&T and their
Yeah.
song Mean Streak, because they had that on there. I bought the compilation because of Dawkins Breaking the Chains was on there, and I had seen the video and I really liked it. And I couldn't find the album anywhere.
And that's basically what it was for me. I can't remember which specific song. I want to say it was "Don't Fear the Reaper." It had become big on Saturday Night Live too. And I don't know if that was before or after I got this, but I remember, having it made me take more recognition of Blue Oyster Cult. Like, oh, I know that song. That's hilarious. And picked up more. So there's always these like little stories behind why you get into music, and it's always interesting.
Oh, absolutely. So that leads me to my big four life-changing albums. So number four for me, and all these are big names for the most part, and all of them are pretty big albums if you ask my opinion. Um, but there's a reason. So number four for me, Iron Maiden, Number the Beast. It's the first Iron Maiden album that I purchased, and I had seen the video for Run to the Hills. I've seen the video for Number the Beast. I thought this was so cool. I was like, I have to have it. And I remember jumping on my grandmother's bed, and my aunt was visiting from upstate New York, and I go, check out this album I got. This is awesome. And I'm bringing this Number of the Beast 666 thing to two very religious people, but they didn't say anything, and I'm surprised when I think about it. But they're like, oh, look at that, and that was it. But I mean, that album is just so good. I mean, it's my favorite Iron Maiden album beyond the fact that it was my first. Just songs like Children of the Damned, The Prisoner, 22 Acacia Avenue, or I already mentioned Beast and Run to the Hills. Then it has my all-time favorite Iron Maiden song with Hallowed Be Thy Name. The 2022 version that they put out with live at The Beast over Hammersmith. They redid the track listing and they added Total Eclipse. That's a pretty good song too. So, but I didn't know that song until much later because I didn't get the single right away. So that's my number four album. My number three album, AC/DC's Back in Black. I got into AC/DC because I'm walking probably from the pizza place in New York where I grew up, which was about 3 or 4 blocks away from my house. And there's a movie theater right next to the pizza place, like maybe 3 doors down. I really didn't mean to say that. But I think quite literally like 3 or 4. But so this is, the old school movie theater where they play one movie. You've got this big screen and you've got this big place, looks like a place where, like an opera house, right? They have a balcony. They have a second floor. I mean, that's the kind of theater it was. And they're playing Let There Be Rock, the movie from AC/DC that came out in late 1980. And it's with Bon Scott, no less. I don't know anything about AC/DC at this time, but I see this poster and it's got this guy with his guitar and he's leaning back, and I don't know what it was. Something attracted me, and I said, I want to see this movie. So I go home and I said to my grandmother, I said, I want to see a movie over at Park Hill. That was the name of the theater. She goes, okay. How much? I go, it's $5. Now in 1980, $5 for a movie was crazy expensive. Okay. Because like most movies at that time were like two, three, like the big blockbuster movies were $3 tops, but this was 5. So I go in there, I slap down my $5. They give me a ticket that looks like a concert ticket. And I'm like, oh, this is pretty cool. I wasn't expecting a ticket back, but you know how when you go to movies, they give you a little stub? No, they gave me a ticket back that looked like a concert ticket. I'm like, oh, this is so cool. I wish I had that ticket today. I go inside and I've been in this theater before, countless times because, my mom and my aunt would take me to the movies all the time. And they have these amps set up at the front to make it look like there's something going to happen live. They literally set up these. I remember distinctly they had like the same setup on both sides, and there was some like white amps as well as some black ones. And then the movie plays, and I was blown the fuck away by this movie. I had to have AC/DC. So what do I buy? Back in Black. Why? Because first of all, they didn't have Let There Be Rock. And so I said, well, I got to get something. So they had this big Black album, and I'm like, oh, this is so cool. Didn't know anything about the fact that Bon Scott had passed away. Yeah, different singer, right? And then for years, I listened to this album thinking that Back in Black is the first song on the album. For years, I'm talking like probably 10, 15 years. I'm thinking that Back in Black's the first song on the album, and that Let Me Put My Love Into You is the last song on the album.
Wow.
Yep, for years. Never noticed that it said side 2 or B. Never noticed. I just put it on, boom. Back in Black, first song.
Well, your history with AC/DC is just all messed up.
All right. So that's my number 3. Number 2. So this is another strange story about how I got into this. But my number 2 album is Metallica's Ride the Lightning. I was working for an architect that had a side job. Basically, he was trying to do his own thing in the evening time. So I was working for this architect from 7:30 to 11 o'clock weeknights during school nights. So, that was special all by itself. And at the time, one of the guys in my class, his brother was doing drafting. And so they hired me to go to work there, and I'm hanging out with this, my for the most part, my best friend's brother. And we started talking about the kind of music that we like. And he was more into like the punk-ish, more of the new wave punkish scene, like, Talking Heads and a lot of the Ramones and Blondie and shit like that. And then a lot of college music too. And then I told him, no, I like AC/DC, Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, right? So he goes, man, if you like that kind of music, you should listen to this show called Hellhole on WNYU. It's every Wednesday night. So I'm like, okay, I'll check it out. So of course I'm working Wednesday nights, right? So I go home the next day and I tell him, when it gets to the following Wednesday, before I leave for work, I put on my cassette recorder. And I don't know if I had a timer or what it was. So I think the show started at 10 o'clock. So I can't remember how it was I got this, but I recorded the show. And the next day, when I got home from school, I put on the tape and I listened to it. And all of a sudden, the superbulous DJ, and our next song is Metallica, Whiplash. And Whiplash starts from Kill 'Em All. I never heard any song in my life that was that fast at that moment. Never. And I was just glued to the radio. What is this song? I rewound it. Whiplash, 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 whiplash. I rewound it and listened to it again and again and again. And I'm like, this song is amazing. I ran to my record store trying to find Whiplash. I cannot remember if it was Ride the Lightning that I bought first or if it was the Whiplash single, because I'm pretty positive it was the Whiplash single. That it was a special one. It was literally Whiplash, because they had come out with Jump in the Fire as their big single, but Whiplash, they came out, it's exactly the same as a Jump in the Fire single, except they did a neck brace remix of Whiplash. I don't know what the difference is. I know there's some subtle differences, but realistically, it's just sonic differences, nothing in the mix itself, or nothing like putting drums here and moving guitar there, nothing like that. But that, I heard the song before, and I'm like, okay, so this is a great song. I heard, and now I hear Seek and Destroy. Now I hear Phantom Lord. Those kind of like, wow, this is really cool. But then I bought Ride the Lightning, and I put that needle down on that first song, and Fight Fire with Fire comes on with that nice little acoustic intro, and then it, the drum roll in, and it this amazingly fast song, which is now faster than Whiplash. I was like, holy shit. I was scared that song was so fucking fast. I was scared. And I'm like, this is so cool. Anyway, so that's my number 2. And then number 1 for me, you mentioned it earlier. I saw a commercial in 1977 for a band named Kiss. releasing their second live album, Kiss Alive 2. You see the bombs, you see the smoke, you see the fire, right? They had a commercial for Kiss Alive 2 that like anybody would buy the record, no matter who. And I I made my aunt, I literally made my aunt buy it for me. Titi, can you buy me a record? Sure. Have her buy this one. And then I make her listen to it with me. Right? And she's like, "Did you ever hear these songs before?" I'm sure I've said this story before on the show. I said, "No, I've never heard these songs before." We sat down, we listened to it. Detroit, thing, you wanted the best and you've got the best, the hottest band in the world. Cheers, All of a sudden, Detroit Rock City starts playing, and I'm mind blown how amazing this was. And the energy doesn't stop all the way through to the end until you get to side 4, and then you get the 5 songs that were studio tracks. Absolutely blown away. Those 4 albums changed my life. Kiss Alive 2 changed my life. It turned me into a metalhead, because up until then I was listening to Michael Jackson on WABC AM radio. Okay. So,
that's a change. Yeah.
Dude, the Village People was big. I mean, disco in 1977, disco hadn't hit it had hit some songs like Saturday Night Fever was pretty big. The Bee Gees. I think it was that year that everything had hit. 78 was big, but when I heard Kiss Alive 2, it changed the game for me. And then I believe it would go from Kiss Alive 2 to AC/DC to Iron Maiden to Metallica. But Kiss Alive and Metallica had the biggest impacts on me.
It's a great leap forward.
Yeah. All right. We've been here a long time tonight. That's our big 4 life-changing albums, and that brings an end to this wonderful episode of Debating Metal. Remember, you can listen to us every week on your favorite podcast platform. So click like or subscribe so you can just wake up and we'll be there waiting for you to click play.
And don't forget, you can interact with us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, or you can send us an email to debatingmetal@gmail.com. If you listen to us on YouTube, be sure to leave us a comment and ring that bell to be notified when we post a new episode. And remember to tune in next week when we spark up another exciting metal debate. On behalf of Kenneth and myself, stay safe and always turn it up to 11.
See ya.